various divisions on the right can be traced through to modern times, such as the discrepancy between the ultra-reactionary Modernist League and the more radical forms of right-wing allegiance. The Monarchist League represents an important point, the fact that a part of the right's urges are purely restorationist in tone. In a sense, they seek nothing more than a return to a previous era, to turn back the clock, before the fateful summer of 1914, let alone 1917. This also has to do with monarchical restoration in relation to those royal families whose prerogative had been well and truly usurped by the revolutions that followed the Great War. Such a view of the world involves a return to a crude form of royal geopolitics, where Europe was essentially divided between three great systems in fact, less systems of government than rival royal houses. In a way, European power was divided up in accordance to a rough triangle on the map, an exercise of imperial trigonometry, where these three massive empires, a fourth if you add the Tsar, faced off against one another. France and Britain, on the other hand, existed to the west of these setups, and had long since established empires for themselves in what became the Third World. Yet there is a degree to which this thinking lingers on in the councils of various Western rulers, as is evidenced by the relative distastes with which radical nationalism is viewed in certain circles. Not just the expected circles either, for elements within the British Foreign Office and the American State Department supported the continued existence of both the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, maybe even the Russian Federation itself, an empire of sorts, India, a failing confederation, and South Africa, long after it had become clear that these entities were in considerable difficulties. This emotion is a type of diplomatic inertia in relation to settled and or established forms of power. It is a type of conservative rhetoric at the level of international affairs. In a sense, it is a form of authoritarian conservative diktat that prefers a form of order that exists to one that might replace it in the future. It is loyal to the spirit of Metternich. It could be said to have a neo-Metternich-like sweep to its modern, cynical and yet authoritarian exercise of foreign powers. In that it was primarily concerned with the codification, extension, and support of structures that exist against the force in the world, communism, that might replace them or take advantage of any difficulties. Interestingly enough, the same sort of opinions transfixed the Foreign Office during the Biafran secession of the Nigerian Civil War, whichever you prefer. For the Nigerian Federation, a British colonial invention, with scant consideration given to the tribal structures existing on the ground, was held to be fixed and inviolate. It was a British imperial creation, and it must last. That was the word from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Hence the fact that the West tacitly endorsed, primarily through not opposing the policy of the Nigerian Muslim junta, something that had the effect of radicalising a number of Western correspondents, missionaries and philanthropists who happened to be there. The common denominator being the Catholicism and the Christianity of some of the Westerners. Kent's experience was indeed decisive, for it radicalised him in a moralistic sense and turned him against the establishment. From there, his chairmanship of the allegedly Soviet fellow travelling pacifist organisation, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. But to return to the internal politics of the right, the sort of restorationism that the Monarchist League represented, and that even animated the League of Empire Loyalists before it existed, had long been overtaken by a more nationalist strand of opinion. This view was in part anti-imperialist in its nationalism, although it did not necessarily go as far as the tacit endorsement of various forms of anti-Western, anti-imperialist Third World nationalisms, in a manner resembling Alain de Benoit and the French New Right, and various forms of left nationalism or neo-fascism in the West. Something that is slightly ironic, given de Benoit's early endorsement, perhaps membership, of the secret army organisation, and his support, in the form of a book, of the rebel Rhodesian colonists during the UDI period. This left nationalist element, that began as a dissident form of proto-syndicalism within the British National Front, a mixture of Strasserites, left National Socialists, and post-Powellite Tories, the populists, failed to take over the organisation and decamped to form the ill-fated National Party, although it is important to point out that the feud that paralysed and ultimately destroyed the National Front was as much to do with the way ahead for the organisation, given the growth of its electoral support, as anything else. The dispute could just as easily be interpreted, ideology aside, as a debate over the past of some of the Front's leaders, and whether they should have stepped into the background for the good of the organisation in order to establish the prospect of electoral success. In any event, the relatively defeated National Party faction was to stage a second-generation coup in the front that led to their ascendancy prior to the damaging split over ideology and personality in 1986, by which time the organisation had electorally failed anyway. In that sense, it failed in 1975. These events were soon to be followed by another split within the ranks of the revolutionarily nationalist NF. This time, over the working out of the semantics and metaphysics of conspiracy in relation to those influenced by Catholic and National Socialist ideas, against those who were loyal to a more new right version of reality. As interesting as the trajectory of right political fringe proves to be, not forgetting the fact that in much of the second, third and fourth worlds it is politics that matters, it is essentially irrelevant to the British political scene. In the British political system, only those who are inside the circle, within the establishment, ultimately in the House of Commons itself, are the ones who matter, are the politicians and statesmen who can affect national destiny. Therein lay the extreme difficulty of Mosley's position. How could he come to power in relation to a system that still partly thought of itself as a political preserve of a certain class, the deliberations of a political caste, with sub-aristocratic inflections? In this culture, an ambience partly based on the classical conception of libertas in the manner of the Roman Republic, how could a strong man come to exercise power in the national interest? It was as if the system was deliberately opposed to the military chieftain and the would-be monarch, at least a monarch who could exercise authority rather than remain symbolic. Such a view of the world was opposed to the Tarquin royal house and the perfection of Caesarean ideas, what could only be called the grand foreplay of an honourable man. In short, British rule, whether imperial or post-imperial, was the rule of a class that found itself divided into faction, yet linked together through wealth and judicious marriage, so that the new blood could be readily accepted. Yet it was also a failed class. It had won the empire largely due to accident, and it had lost it by design. In other words, the ruling class did not have an oppositional strand running through it in relation to the precepts of even attenuated liberal democracy. There was an authoritarianism between this class and others, and to spare. But there was not an authoritarian drift within this class itself. The ruling class politician of demagogic gifts and forthright opinions could only do so around the medium of a faction. He might organise a phalanx of opinion within or between parties, but at the end of the day he was tied to the nature of the system itself. Various politicians have succeeded in relation to this dilemma. Alfred Milner, for example, who through the semi-conspiratorial usage of the Round Table, a society that was established in order to bring persons of Anglo-Saxon blood closer together, as able to engineer a war in South Africa in order to bring about the Pax Britannicum of which he dreamed. He was one such. Another politician, who succeeded manfully in relation to both nation and party, irrespective of the defects of his class, was the first Pitt, Lord Chatham, whose proactive policies in relation to the commission of the 7 Years' War against France won North America and India for the British Empire. Many other individual politicians could be cited, such as Lloyd George, whose feats of production during the First War at the War Ministry and his use of newsreel footage against the enemy both predated the examples of Speer and Goebbels on the other side during the rematch. This type of rubric applies to a wide number of statesmen, such as Winston Churchill, a veteran infighter and warhorse who turned the entire establishment around in relation to their view of Hitler, while it also applies to lesser figures of a contemporary sort, like Dr. David Owen and Michael Heseltine, by virtue of the fact that they had some residual political talent. In Dr. Death's case, he was an Atlanticist, a right-wing social democrat, and a man with a domineering and semi-authoritarian character, hence the fact he ended up running his own political party, the SDP. This appears to be the somewhat forlorn prospect of most decisive leaders in British politics, whether their parties, movements or sects go under the name of the SDP, the Bevanite, or alternatively the Bennite movement. The Lloyd George against the Asquithian Liberals, Union movement, the South Down Official Union Association, and in the case of Enoch Powell, the British National Party, even the Workers' Revolutionary Party. The lesson appears to be, do not break from either the tyranny or the embrace of one's party. In a strange way, there is a similarity with the Anglican Church, the state church, in that if one goes outside it, with the sole exception of Rome, then one is embracing a sect. The view in the establishment politics, in particular, is that one must never break from the party of one's class, at least one's party, most particularly the Tory party, for to do so is to enter the sectarian jungle beyond established parties, and thereby court disaster. It is almost as if to go beyond the party, merely to change party, is another matter. It is to border on the treasonable. It is to set oneself up against the entire nature of the ruling class. One of the many reasons, in the opinion of this particular author, why so many opportunities have been lost in the 20th century. In the politics of ancient Rome, the situation was quite different, for here the entire purpose of politics, partly due to the restricted nature of the franchise, was to form a faction out of the nature of one's own class. Indeed, when we last mentioned these matters, we had reached the triumvirate of Caesar, Crassus and Pompey. Let us return to them now. By this time, the domination of the Pompeian faction in Rome was becoming open. It rested on an alliance of money, men, and measures, as all political compacts must. Moreover, underneath the consular power of his then ally Caesar, linked together with the wealth of Crassus, there lay a network of military commands in the provinces that played into the hands of the Eastern general, irrespective of his personal clout in matters of patronage. A new command structure was given to the provincial armies in order to make them more compliant in relation to the Pompeian cause, and more useful as an instrument of coercion over the oligarchy in Rome. To this end, Caesar was given control of the armies of Cisalpine Gaul, and later of Transalpine Gaul, the whole point being that the masters of these particular armies were themselves the key potentates in relation to unfolding events in Rome. Pompey and Caesar also manoeuvred to elect members of the aristocracy who could be bound into the future structures of the dynasts, such as Piso and Gabinius. Even then, certain political rivalries, particularly involving Crassus, superficially the more isolated of the three, had to be watched and contained, especially when Cicero was a proponent of the traditional class that had generally ruled Rome. In this respect, Clodius turned out to be a difficult tribune. When we remember that the tribunes had the power to block legislation, short of outright dictatorship in Rome. The latter harried Pompey, and made himself to be both a nuisance from the general's point of view and a partisan of the popular cause. In all this he was encouraged by various elements of the oligarchy, an ancient family like the Vitelli, for instance, who were alarmed at the strides towards dictatorship that the Pompeian faction seemed to be making. This had its counterpart, however, in the double game, the game of invisible chess played against oneself that Crassus was engaged in at the time, for he distrusted his relative isolation from the scene and the overarching ambition he detected in Pompey, even if not at this stage in Caesar himself. Moreover, it was natural that in such a dispute he would slightly tack against the wishes and tendencies of his own group. The triumvirate, due to his blood relationship with the Metelli, aided and augmented by the keen political partisanship of his brother Appius. Because it often happens in politics that one occasionally tacks against the nature of one's own side, either for reasons of patronage, or prestige, or for ideological reasons. It is as if to say that politics is conspiratorial. It is a mixture of compact and broken compact at its innermost level, where individuals shadow themselves, dance and caterwaul at a certain distance from the nature of their own ideology, all for the purposes of extending their own self-interest in the game at any particular time. One of the reasons why the right, in a micrological as well as a macrological way, is so enamoured by the prospect of conspiracy, either with a big or a small c. For the raw stuff of politics, its essential moment, the muscle and the sinew out of which it is made, is indeed conspiratorial, in that it consists of the struggle of cross-grained factions against themselves, a matter of intrigue and counter-intrigue, plot against plot, the resumption of a forbidden movement and an icy gesture, the fact that everything contains within itself, in a Neoplatonic way, all forms of reality. This is a moment where, rather in the manner of those early 19th century silhouettes, the trace echo of a lost essence can surprise itself, in the sense that politics, certainly at the level of organisational intrigue, or factional, group, cabal, plot and tendency, is multifaceted, self-reflective, and the whole purpose is never to say no, is never to cut off the possibility as a military strategy of a particular form of advance or retreat. In politics, therefore, all options remain open until they are closed, until a solitary line of success leads to enmity and an absence of discussion, the impossibility of a certain alliance, the necessity of fighting it out, of making a declared decision to oppose something or other. Then warfare, struggle, or conflict immediately supervenes. This is the reality of politics, one of the reasons why it is so decidedly a male form of discourse and activity. Hence the fact that women are alienated from it and have very little impact over it when all is said and done. For the reality of the female is to nurture, to reflect, to find agreement and possible consensus, to be socio-centrist, at least in part, certainly not to break things up, to be divisive and censorous, to divide in relation to Homer's definition of masculinity. The difficulty with this type of conspiracy, however, is when it becomes conceptual, problematic, if not metaphysical, when one leaves behind the actual physical experience of politics and reduces things to the level of theoretical conspiracy, i.e., speculation about the speculative nature of political praxis, conspiracy theory. The right, in particular, is unduly fond of conspiracy theories. Their overlapping and interdisciplinary qualities, the degree to which one does not have to master an enormous amount of information in order to become proficient in them, for they are highly stylized entities, metaphysical conceits, things that turn back upon themselves in wonder. In short, they are, as the Situationist thinkers to Bowden and others put, magical forms of thinking. Magical forms of thinking, opinions that otherwise had a religious usage. Notably, the New Right in France and Alain de Benoist have completely broken from the ancient conspiratorial usage, in part because they wish to see themselves as a completely new usage, a genuinely new right, but also because of the anti-Christian stance, the degree to which they have embraced pre-Christian or pagan culture. For de Benoist, the conspiratorial view of the world, its essential moment, is highly dubious. It partakes of the Christian worldview from which he wishes to escape. He and his fellow travellers in The Movement see it as a form of Christian reductionism that they wish to reject and overcome. The conspiratorial viewpoint has always had a medieval element to it. Something partakes of the magical, if not magical, with a K, thinking. The halitosis of irrationalism, the degree to which it is not entirely of the modern world. In certain respects, a refutation of the modern world in the Evolian vein. There is a hint of the anti-pope about such thinking, the individual who would be presented to the Holy Roman Emperor of the day with a noose around his neck in order to atone for various infractions, real or imagined. In a sense, it is a deliberately irrational way of thinking, hence the delirious excitement of various right-wing groups who adopt this understanding of reality in order to think themselves out of the modern predicament. Perhaps the use of the word feel would be more accurate than think. In that anti-modernists, those who are against the modern world in the manner meant by Evola, are more than likely to adopt a form of thinking that is itself pre-modern or anti-modern in tone. It is as if the theory about the thought and the nature of the thought itself are contiguous. They come together at a particular level of reality, as if the epistemological basis of the thought and the discursive movement are one and the same. Such a form of thinking is most readily accessible in nearly all of the old fringe parties of the classic right, the old right, as de Benoist and the French New Right would see it, who cling to the speculative notion of the mask behind the mask, the hidden motif or tabernacle of wonder. It could be said that this type of thought is self-justifying, a world unto itself, a terra incognita, in the manner of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, where a whole prehistoric civilization is said to subsist around the Arctic, untouched by human hand. Interestingly enough, the Wyndham and Lewis critic Paul Edwards, commenting on the latter's aggressively magisterial satire, The Apes of God, said that it resembled the forbidden plateau of the Lost World that had been untouched by human hand. In this sense, the new right is a definitive rejoinder to the old, a deliberate reversal of fortune, an attempt to think out the same set of assumptions from a completely different position. It wishes to get beyond the smell of incense, the bells and smells from which this type of thinking originates. For if we are honest about it, this type of thinking is deeply religious and medieval, at least in one of several different senses. It partakes of some of the mystical eddies and shards, some of the hallucinatory glow of various canvases by Hieronymus Bosch and the Flemish school, itself a presentation of reptilian entities, lizards, griffins, harpies of derangement, octopi, numerous bipeds, as well as tainted things that crawl along on all fours, women of low repute in the former life, who are to be found coupled with toads and other foul things, the apparitions of darkness. There is a hint of the scandalous, of the veil ripped away in such things, the degree to which they imitate, almost in the manner of the Gnostics, that they are the realities within reality itself. It is as if one mask only succeeds in covering another. For when he rips one covering from the face of his imaginary assailant, he only finds another identity underneath, his own visage left screaming behind the joke mask of a gorilla. Since such a view of the world involves ripping various masks from their alleged suitors, what is the answer for determining who's behind it all? Who is it? What are they? Where do they come from? What do they want? The most common answer that the far right has ever come up with is the Jews. An irrational designation at best, albeit a relatively unsurprising one at that, given the history of this area of politics and the need to find a scapegoat for the modern world. Because make no mistake about it, the old parties of the classic fascist right were searching for an explanation behind reality, something that would explain it all, something that would reveal the absence of forbidden wonder to itself. This type of thinking, in the Nietzschean sense, the impossibility of progression and the cyclical nature of what it is to be human, the pessimistic ardour, the morphology of such a belief, is quite evident and very easy to understand. It involves, does it not, the possibility of the absence of forgiveness, the belief that there is a set pattern or plan to existence, when there may not necessarily be. Nonetheless, the opponents of this perspective, and there are many of them, given the nature of the crimes the German National Socialists committed in their name, should not be unnaturally smug, since there is an enormous amount of irrationalism on the left. When we remember that both of the political extremes feed off one another to a certain extent, and that they both desire similar outcomes with a keen passion. Ultimately, both sides politically, and this is extremely true of political activists, want simple catch-all explanations of reality. They want to be able to say that there is one thing behind contemporary reality that they loathe and wish to extirpate. In one case, it is capitalism. Capitalists, more proficiently, the system, the capitalist system. On the other side, most particularly for acknowledged neo-Nazi organisations or groups, or at very least fascistic parties with National Socialist overtones, it is the Jews. More intelligently put, the fiscal base for international and increasingly monopolistic capitalism, itself under the control, in whole or part, of parasitic Jews. Even this is complicated, however, because the southern as opposed to the northern fascist tradition within Europe is hostile to such viewpoints, or finds them irrelevant. This is particularly so in relation to the Italian tradition, where prognostications about reality have not been based on race to anything like the same degree, primarily because Caucasians are far more likely to be ethnically mixed in these parts of the world. When I said magical thinking, I essentially meant what I said, in that metaphysical conspiracies often partake in the nature of magical thought, of the Illuminati in the general sense, and the occult. There are correspondences between far-right beliefs and the occult, less in practice than in theory, for what else is much of Nietzschean thought than a secularization of various occultic ideas, delivered with great energy and stylistic grace at the end of the 19th century. The whole conception that life is circular and turns back on itself, the belief in a necessary and stoical fatalism, the understanding that an individual can be transfigured by acts of will, the notion that good and evil do not exist, or that at the very least that morality begins and ends with the individual psyche, itself amoral, the notion that without barbarism civilization cannot exist, the understanding of the fact that the majority can never be free, and that only the initiated and elect, obviously a minority, are apprised of the facts, the belief that social hierarchy is necessary and divinely ordained, hence the essential conservatism of occult ideas. What are all of these except the transposition of occult law, and in turn, of Nietzscheanism at one remove? There are some of the ideas for which the occult, the hidden path, is famous. Of course, there is a great split within the occult between those who believe in the extrasensory phenomena which they deal having a physical existence, and those who do not. The latter, more influenced by psychological ideas, believe that such structures and forms, whether angels or demons, gods or the devil, partake on different levels of consciousness, are metaphors for different levels of actuality within the mind, that they are psychological rather than physical structures, all of which relates to the metaphysics of conspiracy in different ways. In truth, the whole point of the notion of conspiracy is to apprehend reality, emotionally or stylistically, rather than intellectually, something that has great currency within politics, for contrary to the central rationalism of liberal ideology and its intellectuals, the shards of the Enlightenment tradition within humanism, most political formulations are anti-rational, irrational, or emotive. Take a classic left-wing conspiracy, for example, the libertarian socialist angle, associated with Lobster magazine amongst others, that much of society and politics is run from within the state by a quote-unquote secret state, namely the security services. Various corollaries to this idea are the notion that the left never gets anywhere because it is infiltrated and subverted by paid agents of the Secret Service and the Special Branch, the political element of the British police. This is not a particularly rational view, though it has some truth to it, but not very much, since it tends to blame an external agency for what essentially are internal matters. For instance, the internal explosion that destroyed one of the two main parties of the Trotskyist left during the 1980s, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, was held to be due to conspiratorial machinations by some of its former leading lights, an estimation that had little to do with reality. When I met with Colin Redgrave, one of the gurus of this particular movement, he blamed the split, what other rival Trotskyist group called the implosion of Healyism, on misinformation disseminated by the ruling class press and the non-working class, i.e. anarchist press, together with multiple splits engineered by MI5 and derivatives thereof. Sounds very similar to Joe Owens, doesn't it? None of which appeared to be specially convincing. From the perspective of an anti-Trotskyist and an outsider like myself, the split seemed to be revolved around gross personality breaches between some of the principal players. It was an actors' party, after all. Disagreements over the use of Arab money — the party took money from various Arab security services to fund its activities, hence its militant anti-Israeli line — and the allegations of rape against female members that went back to the pre-Workers' Revolutionary Party days of the Socialist Labour League. This was more than enough to cause such an outfit to come apart at the seams, to disintegrate into not more than 8 different parties, sects, and grouplets. So much for the disruptive and ever-present hand of the establishment conspiracy. But let us return to the essential point. The notion that conspiracy, with a large C, and of a metaphysical character, is essentially an emotional form of logic, a type of aesthetic trace element, where one thinks artistically, laterally, and reflexively. Conspiracy theories are artistic. They understand reality without defining it. They perceive one pattern from among others in a carpet, to use an old image from artistic forethought. They cannot be disproved, nor can they be accepted as fact. In fact, they are gestures in pursuit of themselves, displacements of the actual, in terms of wonder. The conspiratorial usage is essentially the intellectual apparatus of the everyman. It is the lower class notion that the rich are against them writ large. And this is one of the reasons why the far right is so enamoured with such notions. The extreme right represents, at least in part, a highly emotional version of the thinking of the everyman. In some respects, the bargain basement rhetoric and opinion of the apolitical majority of the population. Indeed, most sociologists concur with extreme reluctance that the emotional opinions of most normal people in the society are perilously close to those of the extreme right. Consequently, the great fear of the right fringe amongst liberal opinion, even when it is everywhere triumphant, and the belief that liberalism, however defined, the moral sensitivity of the educated, in inverted commas, has to be preserved at all costs from the reactionary and negative, uneducated impulses of the majority. It is the fear that liberalism, something that defines itself as being able to see the other man's point of view, is the outer skin of an otherwise very conservative and illiberal fruit. Indeed, such a belief system, the psychic spasms of the chattering classes, their deep hatred of populism, both holds that the extreme right, let alone its alleged intellectual gurus, are doubly dangerous because they reveal the psychic taint of the masses, their endemic illiberalism and the absence of sophistication to themselves. The educated and articulate right is doubly dangerous, therefore, because it provides an intellectual mantle for the airing of popular sentiments, prejudices to the liberal mind. From here, the sheer loathing in liberal circles for liberal democratic politicians like the FDP in Germany at the moment, who are flirting with populism in order to prevent an outflow of opinion to the right, particularly the Republicans. The contemporary liberal is faced with a paradoxical choice. On the one hand, he supports institutions of mass suffrage and democracy, almost extravagantly so. On the other hand, he is deeply suspicious and hostile to the slumbering populist passions he senses lurk in the breasts of the masses. In a sense, he is pro-democratic and anti-democratic at one and the same time. One of the reasons that centrist, liberal, or quasi-enlightenment opinion is obsessed with the demons of popular culture, the far right, even conspiratorially so. But to return again to the nature of conspiracy theory, the whole point about this theory is that it is static rather than dynamic. It partakes in a disused movement. It is a statuesque view of reality, in that it doesn't change. In this way, at any rate, it resembles the classical. It seems to understand a version of reality that remains dormant and prefigured, fixed and unchanging. This is one of the most important things about it. It is congealed and unyielding in its formulations. It purposely denies fluidity and the dynamic within history. It is opposed to the idea of historical events as movable mass of otherwise contingent happenings. It denies the fact that history is an ungovernable and partly contingent set of events. It exists beyond contradiction, and as a consequence, it is not reducible to the pre-packaged explanations of reality. The truth is that conspiracy theories are wrong in their essential characteristics. They are not rationally or intellectually true, insofar as intellectual or ideological notions about life are considered to be rational propositions. The other salient feature is the hard and unyielding aspect that they present to the world, for opinions that are otherwise so fugitive in form. The fact that once you have come across them, there is literally no more to find out. These ideas never develop themselves. They never lead to anything else. They remain apart, distanced and alone. Wherever an individual first came across them, in essentially the sub-theoretical works of the intellectual right, it does not matter, for such notions never really change their spots. A reader can come across them in A.K. Chesterton's The New Happy Lords, in Hitler's Mein Kampf, in Yockey's Imperialism, in Is There a Conspiracy by John Tyndall, The 11th Hour, answered in the affirmative, or elsewhere. Wherever you come across these ideas, they all remain the same. Moreover, the very tendacious and tautological nature of conspiracy theory means that these books begin to quote each other in an intellectually incestuous way, because there is no other proof for the theories they outline, hence the religious nature of its thinking. This initiatory quality, the fact that it is sacramental in tone, something to be revealed and then dispatched into darkness, like the occult notion of induction or initiation into the mysteries, once the individual has been informed on various verities, they remain what they were, unchanging variables of wonder, exercises in practical magic, at least in a political sense. The other thing about these ideas is that they are essentially tautological. They are paradoxes in and of themselves. They cannot be proved. No one can gainsay that. But they cannot be disproved either. In short, they are intellectually hopeless, and best dispensed with in the manner of the Benoit and the New Right. Nevertheless, it should not be said that such theories are solely of the right. Far from it. They tend to percolate on the right end of the spectrum. However, because of the normative and intuitive perspective of the right, it's concerned with the shimmering surface of things and its divine superficiality. For these ideas are aesthetically true, insofar as nothing can be aesthetically disproved, in the manner of various artworks, where the author or composer of the piece has been said to transgress upon artistic truth, a monumental concept, something beyond rationality, and yet not regarded by critics or practitioners of the arts as an idiotic judgment. Therefore, this thinking partakes of both the artistic and the religious in its high-flown illogical symmetry of otherwise irrationalist and romantic intellects. They are searching for an answer to the question, who is behind it all? Even before it has been asked. It is the spiritual hunger which Julius Evola detected and appealed to. On the right, this spiritual hunger makes it so prone to adopt this type of erroneous theory.